On the night of February 17th, 1864, 8 men climbed into a narrow iron vessel off Charleston, South Carolina. There was no engine, no electric motor, no modern oxygen system. 7 of the men would turn a hand crank to drive a single propeller. The 8th would steer. Their target was a United States Navy warship anchored offshore. What happened next changed naval warfare forever. The tiny submarine sank the enemy ship. Then it disappeared. And for more than a century, no one knew exactly what had happened to the 8 men inside. The vessel was the H.L. Hunley. By early 1864, Charleston was being strangled by a Union naval blockade. Confederate engineers had already experimented with unusual underwater weapons, hoping that a small craft could approach warships too closely for their heavy guns to respond. Hunley was one of the boldest experiments. The pressure on Charleston helps explain why anyone was willing to risk such a machine. Union warships had tightened the blockade around the port, restricting supplies and threatening one of the Confederacy's most important coastal cities. Conventional ships could not easily break the cordon. Confederate planners needed something the blockaders had never faced before. Even Hunley's final mission reflected lessons learned from disaster. After the October sinking, Confederate Commander P.G.T. Beauregard no longer wanted the craft diving beneath enemy ships. The attack was redesigned around a spar torpedo fixed ahead of the bow, allowing the vessel to attack while operating at or near the surface, rather than passing underneath its target. Built in Mobile, Alabama in 1863, the roughly 40-foot vessel was made from iron boilerplate. It was extremely cramped. 7 crewmen sat along a bench and turned a long crankshaft connected to the propeller. At the front, the pilot controlled the rudder and diving planes. This was not a submarine in the modern sense. It was a dangerous machine at the edge of what 19th century engineering could achieve. And before it ever attacked the enemy, Hunley had already become a killer. On August 29, 1863, while preparing for operations in Charleston Harbor, the submarine suddenly sank at the dock. 5 men died. The vessel was recovered. Then, on October 15th, it sank again during a training exercise. This time, all 8 men aboard were lost, including Horace Lawson Hunley, one of the men behind the project, and the person whose name the vessel carried. The submarine was raised again. By then, it had already killed 13 men without sinking a single enemy ship. Still, Lieutenant George E. Dixon convinced Confederate authorities to give Hunley another chance. He assembled a new volunteer crew, and they prepared for a mission that looked almost suicidal. Their target was USS Housatonic, a 16-gun Union sloop of war of about 1,240 tons, stationed several miles off the entrance to Charleston Harbor. Hunley carried a weapon that sailors of the period called a torpedo, but it was nothing like a modern self-propelled torpedo. It was an explosive charge packed with black powder and mounted on the end of a long spar projecting from the submarine's bow. To attack, Dixon and his men would have to drive their 40-foot craft directly toward a much larger warship and bring the explosive device against its hull. There would be almost no room for error. Shortly before sunset, on February 17th, Hunley left the Charleston area and headed toward the blockade. The night was clear and moonlit. The Union record of the attack still survives. Officers aboard Housatonic later testified that the strange object was first seen only about 75 to 100 yards away. From that moment to impact, they had roughly 2 minutes. The ship tried to move, but the attacker was already too close. At about 8:45 p.m., a lookout aboard Housatonic noticed something strange in the water. At first, it looked like a porpoise, then perhaps a floating log, but it was moving toward the ship. Fast, the alarm was raised. Housatonic's crew tried to slip the anchor chain and back the engine. Sailors fired small arms at the approaching object. The ship's heavy guns were of little use against something so low in the water and already so close. Within minutes, Hunley reached Housatonic's starboard side. The explosive charge detonated. The blast tore open the Union vessel below the waterline. Housatonic began sinking almost immediately. Most of the crew escaped into boats or climbed into the rigging, which remained above the shallow water. 5 men died. But the attack had succeeded. For the first time in history, a submarine had sunk an enemy warship in combat. Then came the mystery. Hunley never returned. Dixon and all 7 men with him vanished into the darkness. There are historical accounts suggesting that a blue signal light was seen after the attack. Dixon had reportedly arranged such a signal with Confederate forces on shore to indicate that the mission had succeeded. If that light really came from Hunley, it raises a disturbing possibility. The crew may have survived the explosion. They may have begun the journey home. And something happened afterward. For decades, people searched the waters off Charleston. Nothing. Hunley became a legend. Then, in 1995, a team led by author and underwater explorer Clive Cussler located the wreck. It was buried beneath the seabed several miles off Sullivan's Island. 5 years later, on August 8, 2000, the submarine was carefully raised from the ocean floor. For the first time in 136 years, Hunley returned to the surface. When archaeologists excavated the recovered submarine, they also found personal artifacts that made the crew suddenly human again. Among them was a bent gold coin carried by Dixon, long associated with the story that it had helped save him from a bullet at the Battle of Shiloh. The wreck was no longer just a machine. It was a sealed 19th century time capsule. Researchers hoped the wreck would finally answer the question that had followed it since 1864. What killed the crew? But the submarine revealed a mystery even stranger than expected. The remains of all 8 men were found largely at their assigned stations. There was no clear evidence of a desperate attempt to escape. Their bones showed no obvious new injuries. The pumps did not appear to have been set to remove water from the crew compartment, and the submarine's emergency keel weights had not been released. If the crew knew they were flooding and had time to react, why did they apparently do so little? Researchers have examined several possibilities. Perhaps the shock wave from Hunley's own explosive charge incapacitated the men. Perhaps the vessel was damaged and slowly flooded. Perhaps the crew lost consciousness from lack of breathable air. Perhaps some combination of blast, water, mechanical failure, current, and human physiology doomed them before they understood what was happening. Scientific studies have produced important clues, but there is still no universally accepted final explanation for the loss of Hunley. And that is what makes the story so haunting. The men inside were not operating a machine perfected by decades of submarine engineering. They were testing a new form of warfare in real combat, inside an iron tube barely large enough to hold them. Their vessel had already sunk twice. 13 men had already died in it. Yet Dixon and his crew climbed inside anyway. They entered the Atlantic darkness with a hand-powered propeller, a black powder charge, and no guarantee that they would ever return. They succeeded in their mission. USS Housatonic went to the bottom. Naval warfare changed, but the first submarine crew ever to sink an enemy warship never lived to see what they had accomplished. Today, H.L. Hunley is preserved in Charleston, while researchers continue studying the vessel. More than 160 years after that February night, we know where the submarine ended its journey. We know who was inside. We know what ship they destroyed. But the final moments of those 8 men remain hidden. Hunley made history in a matter of minutes. Then the ocean kept its last secret.